Okay, got?
Yeah.
All righty, perfect. Okay, here goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we have back on our churning champion back tonight is Yves Engler. He is one of Canada's finest popular leading truth-telling and myth-busting historians, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist thinker, and a member of all sorts of solidarity groups, most notably the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and Disruption Canada. And yes, he's an activist journalist and is the author of several books. Canada and Haiti, Waging a War on the Poor Majority, co-authored with Anthony Fenson. The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, Canada and Israel, Building Apartheid, A Propaganda System, How Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation, Stop Signs, Cars and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay, which he co-wrote with the lovely and super wonderful Bianca Mugeni, his wife and director of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping, The Truth May Hurt, The Ugly Canadians, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, Left Right, Marching to the Beats of Imperial Canada, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy, and Stand on Guard from Whom, A People's History of the Canadian Military. And last but not least, his autobiography, Playing Left Wing from Rink Rat to Student Radical. Wow, my mouth is almost dry. Welcome back, Yves, one of my favorite peoples.
Thanks for having me.
It's an honor to have you, and also thank you for coming on. Exactly, thank you for also coming on such short notice. This is completely unplanned, so it's a real honor to have you back on. So Yves, first question, because we are a bit strict on the time. So the first question I want to ask you, briefly, if it's even possible, is your take on the Conservative Party leadership race and the rise of the obnoxious former Reform Party man, then Canadian Alliance, and now Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poliviere, and also the former progressive conservative man, Jean Charest, part of Brian Mulroney's cabinet, and who was the premier of the province here based in Quebec under the Liberal Party. And yeah, what do you make of those two and the fact that Conrad Black, Rex Murphy, the whiny little bitch, Jordan Peterson, and a quarter of the National Post seems to really be all for Pierre Poliviere? Your response?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't. I think that Charest would probably be a little bit less bad as a leader of the party. Poliviere kind of seems to represent the, a sort of, I guess, somewhat of a Trumpian kind of element of the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But. Yeah, I don't. I mean, it's a disturbing. I think he's clearly into alliances with all kinds of disturbing forces, and he represents a sort of, continued climate criminality, kind of turbocharged, and there's all kinds of. He kind of dabbles with a sort of kind of right-wing conspiratorial kind of world of politics. That's obviously troubling. I'm not certain that at the end of the day that the difference between the two of them, if they actually became prime minister, would be that substantive.
You mean him? You mean him or Charest?
Yeah, between him and Charest. And, the argument goes is that he's going to be less likely to be able to defeat Trudeau because a lot of what he says is outside of bounds for even the, for the sort of right-wing establishment. So I guess if you frame it from the lens of is it better to have a Liberal prime minister or a Conservative prime minister, according to a certain argument, that Polievre is less likely to win, so therefore Charest would be a more tactical thing. And if you don't want a conservative government, I mean, Charest was he's a sort of a pro-business, pro-neoliberal conservative that's relatively open to. He's not going to move on trying to criminalize abortion or go in a certain kind of direction of sort of social conservative kind of stuff that Polievre.
Hey, once upon a time, there was a party called the Progressive Conservative, which was basically, when you really looked at it, in the end of the day, kind of just a diet liberal party, fiscally conservative, but not socially conservative. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what Charest sort of represents. And when he was premier of Quebec, obviously the 2012 student strike was, targeting him. So he was very much viewed as somebody who pushed neoliberal reforms in Quebec in a way that was viewed as somewght ideological, not just sort of politically expedient, but also sort of ideological in that. So he's somebody who's had all kinds of ties to all kinds of business, corporate world. So, but in the big picture, I mean, I don't follow the conservative race that closally, but my guess would be the Liberals will win, particularly if Polievre is there. But it is also going to become it's going to be 10 years into Trudeau's time in office, which would tend to lead to people just deciding they want something different. But so in that case, if Polievre was able to frame himself as just a sort of change candidate, part of the excitement of the Polievre base is tied to the whole sort of mask mandate and vaccine mandate, COVID kind of question, and how much of that is still kicking around in a couple of years from now when the elections are likely to be held. I don't know. It's kind of interesting that I'd say that there's I feel like there's a right-wing shift, which is kind of, I think that the pandemic sort of brought in a left-wing ideological shift in a certain way, certain with regards to certain kinds of income supports and stuff like that. But I feel like there's a certain kind of right-wing zeitgeist. I think that might be partly tied to the war in Ukraine, and it's all the sort of a lot of the ideological stuff that comes out of that. But certainly the right has had a certain ascendance when it comes to sort of street activism. The convoy kind of protests.
Which was a reactionary ultra libertarian movement, and I know folks that both you and I probably admire when it comes to anti-imperialism and some other subjects, got it badly wrong when they depicted the Freedom Convoy as this working class left-wing populist movement. No, it was a reactionary libertarian. If you want to use the term populist, which is such a badly abused term, but yeah, it was a reactionary libertarian movement, not a left-wing movement. And I'll happily argue to the death people who say otherwise. But Pierre Poliviere definitely the Conservative Party and the People's Party of Canada have definitely been been sort of co-opting and sort of mobilizing that this very popular discontent on all the all the stuff related to COVID. Right.
Yeah. So I agree with that, and who knows where that is in a couple years if elections aren't for a couple years. I mean, Polievre is bad. Charest is not quite as bad. So.
And do you think Poliviere has a good chance of unseating Justin Trudeau? And if that's the case, and if it is the case that this is the last of the white Obama's reign, Justin Trudeau, I was wondering if you could name three big achievements of the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau, and if you can't, how do you compare his record on socioeconomics? In other words, how has he benefited the largely white working class in Canada compared to Lester Pearson, Mackenzie King, his father, Pierre Trudeau, and Jean Charest and Paul Martin, or even Stephen Harper, because many attack Trudeau, saying he continues, the bad policies of Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party, who actually has endorsed Pierre Poliviere, and I'm wondering what's your take on that, and does that say a lot about what we can expect then from Poliviere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Harper endorsed him in large part because he looks like he's in a very strong position to win, and I think Harper's main concern is to not have the party split. That's my sense. And Harper was always like a pretty right-wing ideologue as well, and he was sort of constrained by the reality of public office. And I think you see that to some extent with his foreign policy, where he was, he used foreign policy as the area where he really pushed the envelope, and broke down some sort of barriers in kind of within official Canadian foreign policy. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the historical, I mean, I think that the daycare initiative that the Liberals have put forward is a good thing, and that's substantive. That's going to have long-term positive developments. I think that's already starting.
A sort of a low-cost universal daycare.
A $10 a day daycare program, and so Quebec has that. That's my son Joshua actually just started school today, but he finished. He was in for the last 4 years. Was in a kind of the Quebec equivalent to that's existed for 20, I think it's 25 years. I think it was. So there's that's a positive development that you can credit them with. The carbon tax stuff, I think, has been some positive. It's far from enough, and they've done some other ecological policies that are just criminal in terms of pipelines and their new oil project in the Bay du Nord, the huge, massive oil extraction project that they okayed a few months ago. But I think that there was I'm not knowledgeable enough about the political history to speak to exactly what Pearson's government introduced and sort of how important they were. I mean, they introduced a series of major social programs that were partly tied to the fact that they were in a minority government with the NDP, and it was it was a different time. Neoliberal ideology was on the was not the dominant. It was sort of Keynesian capitalist ideology that enabled some major social program and advancement. I mean, I think the Liberals, that their response to the pandemic, there was obviously way too much money that was given to big companies, but they did introduce relatively decent income assistance programs that were used by millions and millions of people, generally poorer people, generally racialized disproportionately. Yeah, I mean, I don't follow the, right now there's a sort of major Medicare kind of medical, the state of Canadian health system kind of crisis in the media, and I the Liberals' kind of reaction to that. I'm not following it close enough to be, totally confident in what's going on. But they're not, they're dragging their feet even with the agreement they had with the NDP around expanding dental care and some of the pharma kind of proposals that they had brought in. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Liberals are, they're pro Bay Street, but is the Trudeau Liberal government, are they, serious neoliberal ideologues? No, I don't think they're serious neoliberal ideologues. I think they follow the sort of prevailing ideological winds within political culture, and they have some. They play some to the whole, like, their feminist kind of credentials, and the daycare thing kind of fits within that outlook, and
but it does sound to me and funny. This is not the first, and this is not the first time I've asked others on Facebook, how would you compare the current Trudeau regime to past liberal governments, and even PC governments and conservative governments? Many people have a very hard time, like really saying, like, what has been the big accomplishments of the of Trudeau Jr.'s thing compared to a Mackenzie King or a Pierre Trudeau or a. Well, Ketan and Paul Martin both were definitely austerity and very corporate friendly. But yeah, your response.
Well, I think the daycare program is pretty substantive. I don't think we should just throw that out the window. I think that people sometimes, there's no doubt that there was a. Is it? Are you hearing me properly?
Oh yeah, I can hear you.
So there's no doubt that there was a different ethos that the late 1980s, 1990s, and I think Chrétien and Paul Martin reflect that, where there was a real sort of, as you put it, austerity kind of shift and cutting of social programs, selling off of public assets and whatnot, but I also think if you go back in time, I don't think like Lester Pearson, I haven't studied his domestic policy that closely, but Lester Pearson was he was not like some sort of like he was a pro-capitalist type of person and politician. So there was a change to. There was some important social program advancements, but around Medicare, around I believe the CPP, the pension program, and but yeah, I think that when you're living through it, if you were when people who were left wing were living through Lester Pearson's government, they would have seen Lester Pearson as a pro-capitalist politician, and then later on history kind of focuses on a couple of things they were involved in that were good, And right, so I think there's a good chance that history will look back on the daycare program as being pretty substantial from the Liberals, and they will also look back on the carbon tax as being important move. I think that when it comes to their climate policy in general, they'll be understood as serious climate criminals that didn't do a fraction of what was necessary to really deal with the crisis, and basically enabled the climate chaos to worsen. But so I don't know how to I don't think that's certainly Stephen Harper's government. I can't, just sitting here thinking quickly, I can't say that Stephen Harper's government introduced much useful kind of policy. So Trudeau would be doing better than Stephen Harper with regards to the daycare program, and depending on what happens with dental stuff, and yeah.
And that's a perfect segue to this. Now, your book on the Stephen Harper years of ongoing Canadian imperialism. Now, you called the book the ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's foreign policy. Yet, you know what, Yves? I look at this book and I think, what a handsome man with beautiful eyes, and then I look at Justin Trudeau. And I don't know. Justin Trudeau's not my type. I don't think he's handsome. So if you had to do a sequel to House of Mirrors, I have a great title to suggest for a sequel to your book on Justin Trudeau's awful imperialism. Why not The Uglier Canadian? I know Paul J has said to you that your book about Harper should have been called The Uglier Canadian, since Stephen Harper was more or less continuing on with Canadian imperialism. Or, since people do seem to think that Justin Trudeau is attractive, and this is plagiarizing Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, at one point the working title was the Ugly Canadian with Trudeau. Had a slightly different, I can't remember what it was, a slight play off Ugly Canadian. But true titles of books are just marketing, right? Like, they're not just overwhelmed or heavily influenced by sort of marketing. So that was the sort of where the title came from. But yeah, I mean, these aren't like it's more about structural forces than the specific politicians, and we should be very clear about that. And you can make a good case that you shouldn't really even write a book that's just like like Harper focused, because it takes away from the sort of more underlying dynamics. So I think that's a fair criticism. But having said that, there's a sort of like books are there are people who are prepared to read a book criticizing Stephen Harper and hearing the title The Ugly Canadian in reference to Stephen Harper that just aren't into reading that or hearing that title in a different kind of context. So you try to some extent I don't know, sort of align with a certain zeitgeist of the political culture that's so but yeah, I think that there's far more similarities between Stephen Harper's and Justin Trudeau's foreign policies than there are differences.
And looking back, when you did your book on the Harper years, it's interesting what you were saying. So looking back, when you did that book, The Ugly Canadian, did you get more wider interest than usual because of the Harper derangement syndrome that existed?
Yeah.
Or and since you've done books, Harper, did you see a bit of a sharp decrease in terms of the wider Canadian culture's interest in the topics that you explored after Harper?
Yeah, the Harper tour was the best tour I've ever done. I think I did, I forget exact numbers, but it was like 35 cities in like tour. So I had, in the smaller communities, people were still into organizing events, not necessarily huge events, but in smaller places, 15, 20 people showing up. I think I had some of my biggest turnouts in a number of places during the Harper tour. So I had both the most cities, the in a macro level, the biggest numbers. So yeah, there was definitely, there was Council Canadians chapters and other groups that wouldn't usually be that into the foreign policy stuff, but partly because it was criticizing Harper, were willing to into organizing an event and all that kind of stuff, and some academics, same kind of dynamic. So no, there's no doubt that it channeled into a certain type of anti-Stephen Harper kind of politics, and also alongside the book printed I think like 150,000 stickers that were Stop Harper's Crimes, and listed 4 of the Harper's crimes: climate, Palestine, mining, and I forgot what the 4th thing was. But so yeah, no, there was definitely, it tapped into a certain kind of politics, and even a little bit in terms of the reviews, like the Toronto Star guy, Siddiqui, I forget, he's no longer there, but he mentioned the book, and Hill Times, a few places that sort of, they mentioned it partly kind of like from a partisan kind of direction, right? Like that this was sort of, because the Liberals, of course, had even if they didn't agree with the politics of the book, and the NDP for that matter, they had a self-interest in sort of like, they were happy with anything attacking Harper was good for them, right? So, yeah, so it did, and I think that's it's always a balance between. I think it's a mistake to not engage with some of those dynamics, but then it's also a mistake to go too far in just aligning with it's just about Stephen Harper, and if just Stephen Harper disappeared, everything would be fine. So how progressive forces sort of kind of balance that question of taking advantage of certain, the way you framed it was Harper derangement syndrome, or another way of framing it would be just sort of certain type of like anti-Harper zeitgeist, and then like the truth is that even though it got more play than usual, still, as a general rule, Harper's foreign policy was relegated to a sort of side note in left-wing criticism of Stephen Harper, right? The most, I think the one that comes to mind right off the bat was the Tyee. The Tyee did a list of, like, it was like it's online somewhere, but like the Harper's 50 crimes or something to that effect. This big long article, and they didn't mention Libya, even though Libya was like like probably the biggest crime that Harper was involved with, and in so many different ways they violated international law. So in the case of the Harper book, I understood that I was taking advantage of a certain type of political zeitgeist, but also under, I think it was, still pushing the foreign policy specific element into sort of left-wing discussions was really important. And yeah. So.
And then very briefly, are people getting much better at realizing that evil did not start with Stephen Harper or Justin Trudeau?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if people. I don't know. I don't know. I feel comfortable to just say that people are getting better. I think when it comes to foreign policy stuff, which I follow closely, they there is a growing, still very marginal subset of the left that is understanding that Canadian foreign policy is fundamentally pro-empire and pro corporate, and that there's there's sort of they that's a bit of a shift, I think, in the past 10 or 15 years. There's been sort of a growth of radical internationalist critical writing and film and whatnot on Canadian foreign policy. It's still very marginal. It's not, it's at the margins of the NDP, let alone the mainstream. But so I think that that's a positive development, and people seeing that Trudeau has largely just continued Harper's foreign policy has reinforced that. But at the same time, I think that what's happening with in Ukraine, there's a lot of people on the left that have just sort of completely rallied behind Washington and Ottawa's foreign policy in a way that's kind of remarkable. So I don't know where that's.
And then that's a perfect segue. Okay. Well, but that's kind of a well. Then I definitely wanted to talk to you about that, because you were talking about the problems of the left who have jumped the shark on Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you then about the ongoing then real cancel culture when it comes to Palestine justice from McGill University, the ongoing efforts to push this, pardon my language, bullshit definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, as well as the singling out of truth tellers and mythbusters like Eva Bartlett, Aaron Mate, the ongoing persecution of Julian Assange, the censorship and suppression of RT, Iranian, Chinese, and Latin American left-leaning media. And I don't know if you heard recently about the dust-up of I'm sorry if I'm sorry to the guy, I'm going to butcher his name, Laith Marouf, who I believe is Palestinian Syrian, but is based in Lebanon, or he's Lebanese. That does a lot of strong solidarity to Palestine. And yeah, I just briefly, if it's possible, what's your reflections on all of that?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's it's become kind of normalized to just accept that those who are defending a apartheid, Jewish supremacist state, that they can just endlessly attack those opposing apartheid and opposing supremacism as racists, and so that's just become normalized, and it's it kind of goes all the way up the ladder in Canadian politics. But it's wild. It's really shocking. You wonder, like, what how many reports from liberal establishment NGOs would have to say that it's an apartheid state, and how many laws Israel would have to have on the books that prioritize Jews that are just by any just serious investigation obviously supremacist, and then how much violence that Israel would have to met out before people would be like, okay, this is just completely bananas that the person defending all of this apartheid and supremacism and violence and colonial dispossession, that you are the one claiming the others are the racists. I mean, it's again, it's been normalized, so it doesn't seem just completely astounding, but it is, and it's it's very powerful, and there's many elements to trying to unpack understanding what's going on and how that can be. Yeah, I mean, I obviously know Laith Marouf. I was in the Concordia Student Union the year after he was in the executive of the Concordia Student Union, and I think that it's huge scandal now, big front page of the National Post, front page of the Toronto Sun, twice, I believe, at least once, maybe twice in the National Post as well, about Laith Marouf and his tweets and getting government contract, and it's a big long kind of story. But
what was it to help fight against against like Islamophobia and like anti Middle Eastern phobia? But because of this one tweets, I'm not gonna read the tweets. I'll put in the show notes. But he did this one tweet now, where he was basically criticizing, where he harshly was criticizing, ultra Zionist and Jewish supremacists. Now, I probably wouldn't have, but anyways, it's.
Yeah. I don't. It's not just one tweet. I mean, I think that there's a lot of tweets that Laith released that I don't agree with. I certainly don't agree with the wording. In some cases, I don't even agree with the sentiment. I don't think that talking about putting bullet in the head of Zionists, or referring to Zionists as feces, or stuff around like frogs and French Canadians having like lower IQs. I think that stuff I disagree with. I think there's he shouldn't have done. I do, at a macro level, broadly agree with the sentiments of his tweets. I do, and I think Laith's somebody who has, been involved in all kinds of important social justice struggles. He's someone who, played a really important role in the whole media in a Quebec student strike, right? The CUTV live streaming of the mobilization for the Quebec student strike was quite consequential in helping that mobilization, as was widely understood at the time. People like Michael Moore were tweeting out about it and messaging out about the CUTV, and it was quite a big deal at the time. And he's clearly somebody who's done stood in solidarity with Indigenous communities resisting colonialism in Canada, and he's also obviously somebody who has, he's Palestinian and has done lots of pro-Palestine work in Canada. So I think that if people want to slag his tweets, I think that there's lots of legitimate room for doing so, and I think there's parts of the tweets that are genuinely objectionable, parts of them that are just, if you look at his whole body of tweet work, or his whole Twitter presence, that's just he's just playing a certain type of Twitter game and certain type of language that's over the top, or whatever, right? So I think put that into its it should be put into its overarching context. I tweeted out about I think last night, I said that there's been way more attention given. The media's given way more attention to Laith's tweets than they have to the fact that the Trudeau government has enabled its role in enabling illegal recruitment for the Israeli military in Canada, and in terms of registered Canadian charities sending millions of dollars, taxpayer subsidized dollars, I should point out, to the Israeli military, to racist organizations in Israel, to settlement organizations, all of which contravene Canada Revenue Agency rules for registered charities. So both the Foreign Enlistment Act makes it illegal to recruit for a foreign military in Canada, and the Canada Revenue Agency has these rules that should restrict public funds being, again, subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer funds to racist organizations in Israel, settlement groups, Israeli military. So the media is giving way more attention to Laith's Twitter account than they have to those questions, and it speaks to the incredible bias in the dominant media on these issues. But yeah, it's I think I would say that clearly all the worst forces in Canadian political life have picked up on Laith's. There's kind of two different elements going on. One is just the anti-Palestinian element, who are really excited to the pro-Palestinian world is just anti-Semitic, and they're trying to hammer that angle with Laith. And then the other angle, I'd say, is just a more general kind of like right-wing kind of anti-racism work, right, more broadly. And so they're really excited to the Liberals have hired a racist to do their anti-racism work, and it proves that all this anti-racism work that is going on is really just racist, anti-white, or right. So that's what's going on. And so the Laith thing has taken just this huge outsized proportions based upon this sort of convergence of these political kind of dynamics. A little bit of it, I have a sort of a little kernel of sympathy. I mean, it is pretty kind of hypocritical, at least on its surface, of Justin Trudeau taking this really sort of hard kind of moralizing stance on anti-racism when he has this whole blackface kind of history and whatever. So I think that there are the Trudeau's government's anti-racism is obviously it's not about challenge. It's some of the most superficial kind of anti-racism kind of work. I think, but generally better to be being pursued than not being pursued, of course. But the more sort of structural questions are left aside. And one that's, I think, particularly crass, that sort of none of the groups that are funded by the Liberals' sort of anti-racism initiatives would dare to touch, which things like the core group in Haiti, right, where you have foreign ambassadors, with Canada being a major player, it's probably the second most important player, who are basically all light-skinned, and they basically dictate Haitian affairs. And to varying degrees over the past 20 years, they've been doing this. And you have across the board, the NDP, which would claim to be anti-racist political party, they support Canada's participation in the core group, and this is something that many Haitian activists have repeatedly denounced as racist, the core group being a racist entity, and that kind of element of anti-racist kind of ideology doesn't get picked up. And then more structural questions of who owns the economy, and how to if you really want genuine anti-racism and certainly in decolonization, you have to sort of look at whole economic some variation of kind of economic democracy or radical rejigging of the economic inequality and ownership structure. And that stuff is kind of all obviously left aside. And again, I think that the kind of anti-racism work that the Trudeau government's doing is generally better that it's being done than not being done. But it shouldn't it does have an element of it that is quite hypocritical. And I think the right forces sort of pick up on a sort of kernel of truth in some of that, and the Latham Roof thing is they really amplified that angle. They're mostly doing it for their own sort of generally opposition to anti-racist kind of struggles, but they're not completely wrong in some of what they're picking up on with regards to how the Trudeau government kind of has framed these issues.
We're almost out of time, but I have three more questions. I have three more questions left for you, but then just a very quick follow-up. What advice would you give to Palestinian solidarity activists? I mean, the ones, those who are of a Palestinian background, they're always going to keep fighting for their people, and right on. But what would you say to others who might feel burned out from the constant, again, part of my language, but the constant bullshit of fighting for Palestinian rights, being very careful in the language they use? I mean, I don't even use the term. I mean, I think I admire the fact that, like, you are not afraid to call out Zionism for the ideology that it is. I don't even do that. I mean, I'll say ultra Zionist from time to time. But yeah, what advice would you give to Palestinian solidarity activists who might just feel burned out and just are going to have those dark days where they're like, I just can't take this anymore, the injustice?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that it's really shitty to be called names. It's even shittier to be put on things like the Canary List or Canary Mission or whatever they call that.
Yeah. My friend Solomon is on that.
It's not pleasant to be attacked within the university structure, and even in some cases people not get jobs because of it. All that is very unpleasant and should be denounced. That people who are doing what's right and challenging racism and challenging colonialism are being attacked in those ways. But it's nothing compared to what happens to people in Gaza or the West Bank, and it's nothing compared to having your kids killed, or having your mother killed, or your close friend losing, having their leg shot off, or on and on and on, or let alone just the sort of day-to-day injustices of the checkpoints, or the day-to-day injustices of the siege of Gaza. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I think the other part to keep in mind is two parts to it. One is that you're right, you're doing what's right, and you're on the right side, and don't let yourself get confused. I mean, I think be mindful that these attacks are happening and can happen, and that they can cause problems and stuff like that. And so, be mindful, be strategic in how you use your language or whatever. Depending on your, this is to some extent, each context is a bit different, and each individual is in a bit differing degrees of vulnerability and all that kind of stuff. So be sort of careful, or if you want to use that word, but don't confuse yourself that you're not right. You are right in standing up for Palestinians and challenging the the apartheid lobby and challenging the system of Jewish supremacy that Israel represents. So people should be, cognizant of that. And I think also people should be cognizant that there has really been a shift in understanding. It's really slow. It's, troublingly slow. But the reaction, the anti-Semitism allegations, they're on a. I mean, I've been following this for 20 years, so I've seen that this is not new, but the degree to which the smears are thrown around is just at an unprecedented level. And that's not because the Israel lobby and sort of organized Jewish groups like B'nai B'rith or Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. It's not because they want to be smearing everyone. It's because they feel like they have to be, which is another way of saying that there has been breakthroughs and this is the last tactic they have, right? They're left with just anti-Semite, and shut down conversation because they're not really able to make the case for Israel, certainly among sort of liberal-minded people. So as horrendous as the attacks and smears are, they're the tactic that is increasingly employed because the preferred tactics of the Israel lobby groups are not succeeding. So people should take some level of comfort in understanding that.
And people should take great inspiration in the fact that there are many Jewish Canadians, Jewish Americans, Jewish diaspora folk, including Israelis like Mika Peled and Ilan Pape who speak out. So yeah, exactly.
And there's huge numbers of I was just on Twitter just seeing Peter Beinhard, who has a piece in the New York Times today. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but about basically about the anti-Semitism smears by Israel lobbyists. And this is somebody who's got decades and decades of history in organized Jewish organizations, and is somebody who's moved to a pro-Palestinian perspective sort of gradually over the past decade or so. And he's being smeared as an anti-Semite, right?
And he's a neoconservative on top of that.
Rabbi Miviser, who's an activist here that I do a lot of stuff with. He's rabbi. He was in charge of a synagogue for 20 some years, I believe it was, in Vancouver. And he's attacked as an anti-Semite, right? So at some point it all just becomes okay, whatever. What does it mean? So it still clearly has a lot of political and cultural weight. They're clearly doing everything they can to eliminate that political and cultural weight and sort of turn it into one of the Palestine Africa for Palestine Twitter account. They tweeted out a thing a few weeks ago that I saw with a guy with a shirt that said something to the effect of, if you haven't been attacked as anti-Semitic, you're not doing enough for the Palestinian cause. Right? Which is essentially, it's a reality. That's how people should actually look at it. If you haven't been, if you say you're somebody who believes in international justice and you haven't been either directly or some group that you're part of attacked by one of these Israel lobby groups as being anti-Semitic, that it probably means that you're not that group, or you are not doing enough to, put your name out there for the Palestinian cause. That's just a reality.
So. And of course just a reminder to folks that politics 101, when you are being smeared, just call BS to the smear campaign. Don't do what Jeremy Corbyn and his team did. And so I got three quick final questions for you then, Yves, which is, can you reflect on an article which you did, which was a response to a terrible interview The Breach published, complaining about campism, tankies, and leftists who they deem as a problem when it comes to anti-war, anti-imperialism activity. It was not only basically a boring anti-communist leftist waste of space, but equally it was just a smear and a soapbox of attacking people such as myself who speak out on the Western Gulf War, on Syria, and those involved in anti-NATO and anti-pivot to Asia work. And I also just want to say I do like The Breach. They do a lot of fantastic stuff. I've had Elle Jones on the program many times. Hope to have her back on many times, as well as Pamela Palmater. But yeah, I just wanted your reflections on that, because I thought it was really cool of you to have pushed back against that article, given how much anger there was in the private and the public world of Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic gist of my article was to say that, not that there's never a problem with some elements of the left that, in my opinion, get too far down the path of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of dynamic. I think that does happen in some instances, and with regards to some people's position on what Russia's doing in Ukraine, I object. I think that what Russia's doing in Ukraine is clearly contravenes international law and is quite frankly brutal. So I think that there is some role for I don't know, criticism for a left media outlet to criticize anti-imperialist activism for I don't know, taking the wrong pathway in certain situations or whatnot. But we live in a political climate where the NDP is a deeply imperialistic party. The NDP's position on Ukraine is basically, how can we do everything we can to have a chance of getting towards nuclear war, right? The NDP's position is just, criticize the Liberals for not putting in more weapons, not more wild attacks, claiming this is genocide, all kinds of things that are just like often, they're not connected to reality. And so if you're going to be punching down, if you like, on this segment of the anti-imperialist world, and you better be publishing a whole lot that's criticizing the NDP and the mainstream left's imperialist policy, which is infinitely more important than any possible criticism of some of the anti-imperialist world's positions. And of course, The Breach doesn't do that, right? The Breach, to best my understanding, they've never published any article that's sort of talks about the NDP. Like I said, the NDP in the last election in September stated explicitly that they support Canada's participation in the core group. The overtly imperialistic body in Haiti, and quite frankly, like I said, racist body in Haiti. The NDP, openly supported the bombing of Libya. The list goes on and on. And so that is, I think in the article I said something effective like, for every article that you you attack the left, anti-imperialist left, you should be publishing 10 articles that are criticizing the NDP's foreign policy, and then you'd be kind of, okay, well, that's I think that's fair, that's a sort of honest kind of whatever. But in fact, what they did makes it seem like they're more inclined towards just being a sort of like the left end of the NDP kind of media outlet.
Yeah, and I thought it was a great article, and hey, anyone from The Breach, I know we've had people speak out on The Breach on the program. They're welcome to send a right of reply. But that being said, no, I think I think you were, I think you were spot on. And the root of all evil is not communism. The root of all evil is not lefties who are, who maybe sometimes lionize too much Stalin or Assad and so forth. The root of all evil is imperialism, and the left's, the so-called respectable left's role in conserving imperialism, and all these Western do-gooders, these white persons, burden syndrome folk, who, when they say we must do something about Noriega in Panama, we must do something about Gaddafi in Libya, we must do something about Sudan, and we must do something about this, they always end up just carrying water for imperialists, and they never ever pay a penalty for it, and they never ever apologize for, oh wow, I was a chump for the powers that be. So yeah. And second to last question I wanted to ask you, Yves. You wrote an article, a while ago, praising David Suzuki, the popular former CBC Science broadcaster, well-known environmentalist, activist, who I think it's safe to say is fairly much a leftist, maybe even an eco-socialist. Can you talk about why you salute him and his involvement in helping your campaign of the CFPI to get Canada not to have a seat at the UN Security Council? And David Suzuki, I would also say, he, in terms of a broadcaster, he's basically like the Canadian Bill Nye the Science Guy, Sir David Attenborough, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Suzuki has been, he was probably the highest profile person to endorse the United Nations Security Council seat for Canada campaign that 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago, which ultimately was successful. And we made a big kind of media splash around it, and actually campaigned. Had a whole really intense emailing campaign directed at the representatives of the UN missions that sent them we sent them thousands and thousands of emails from Canadians and people around the world on a number of different foreign policy issues. And he's signed a number of letters on Haiti, and he's been willing to, he's somebody who's clearly been willing to, not just sort of accept his, he has his sort of fame and his sort of standing, but put it on the line, and he's talked about, like, in one Globe and Mail interview from a handful of years ago, they asked him, like, what would you do if you had $1 million to donate or something like that, and he said, give it to groups working on an alternative to capitalism. So he's somebody who's pushing the ideological parameters of Canadian political life, and Bianca, my partner, when she was at the LEAP Manifesto, a LEAP organization. One of the last things she did before leaving LEAP was this tour across the country, and Suzuki was keen to speak in every different city. He was willing to he was willing to he was just so gung ho and pushing it and he was he's I think close to 80 years old now, and still keep having that sort of activist fire and understand that the only way to succeed is to just outwork the other side, and to keep is really impressive. And and his willingness, again, he signed a couple letters around Haiti and opposing Canadian policy in Haiti and stuff like that. So
Palestine too, since we've been talking a lot about Palestine today.
And so that's I think that's unique, right? Most of the people who become as famous as David Suzuki, they go in the other direction and they become more cautious, and they want to preserve their name, if you want to frame it like that, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that David Suzuki is definitely one of the rare kind of really famous people, particularly in Canada, that's willing to sort of take up a lot of pretty marginalized causes.
So we salute you, Mr. Suzuki, and please come on the show in the future. And my final question final question, Eve, before I let you enjoy your weekends and playing with your two beautiful little ones, Joshua and Zuri, is this. As an activist and historian, what do you think it's going to take? And this time you are free to not criticize Canada, but to criticize America for this. What do you think it's going to take for the American left and people power movement to show more solidarity to Native Americans in the mainland and Indigenous Hawaiians and Alaskans? And what do you think it's going to take for America to get to the level, more broadly speaking, the way Canada is, New Zealand is, which is reckoning with its settler colonial past and present, in which corporate state media covers more this criminally overlooked, underrated human rights issue and topic of Native Americans? And I must say, I have deep respect for your friend, Aaron Matse, but something really bothered me when I asked him this question when he was on the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour about what's it going to take for the U.S. left to get to the level the Canadian left is with Native Americans, and I was a bit baffled by Mr. Matse's response, which is, well, I don't know, but I think it's getting better, and when it does get better, it'll get better when it does get better. He said something very vague like that, and I've been very pissed off with black leftists when I ask them the same question, including the ones who are actually very good on this topic and showing solidarity, and I get responses like, well, some of their tribal leaders held us as slaves, or when was the last time Native Americans showed us solidarity? To which I am saying in my head, well, there's lots of focus on Black Lives Matter. There's basically 0.1% focus on Native Americans. When was the last time we showed them solidarity? And just in general, I'm just like shocked that the American left, they're great on anti-imperialism. They're great on anti-NATO. Right now they're fantastic on the anti-pivot to Asia stuff, and Palestine solidarity, and Black Lives Matter, and Queer Lives Matter, and feminism. But on the root of all that evil, which is the dispossession, the genocide, and the ongoing brutal subjugation of Indigenous Americans from the mainland to Hawaii and to Alaska, the American left is just terrible on this, and like I said, I take great inspiration from the Canadian left, the Kiwi left, even the Australian left, which does focus on Aboriginal issues, not as much as they should, but just I just wanted your response on that, because in Canada we see Black Lives Matter merging with Native Lives Matter, and we have great people like Pamela Pomatter working with Al Jones, Robin Maynard working with Indigenous folk, and now as you can see, I'm getting way too pissed off. So your response?
I heard Obama would say often about the original American sin was slavery, which seemed pretty tone deaf to me, because obviously the original sin wasn't. I mean, that's a major sin, of course, but the dispossession and theft and genocide is really the original sin. That seems pretty self-evident. But what the strategic pathway towards greater Indigenous solidarity in the U.S. is, I'm not really knowledgeable enough to say. I mean, I think there have been the fights against the Keystone XL pipeline. It seems to me like there was a pretty good upsurge of environmental and Indigenous mobilization and activism on that issue. That was my impression, from afar. so that's a kind of example, I think, where there have been, you know, I don't know, sort of broader left allyship, but you know, I think that like activism is like, I mean, there's, in one sense, it's like there's no secret, and in another sense, you know, it's just like every individual doing what they can to raise these issues is what cumulatively gets issues onto the agenda, whether that agenda is just the left, whether it becomes right onto the, you know, the corporate media. You know, in Canada, it is, you know, at a rhetorical level. Now, at a reality level, the colonial machine, you know, moves on. But at a rhetorical level, there is a recognition that, you know, Canada's genocidal, colonial, that, you know, whether it be the so-called residential schools, if you want to call them schools, that, you know, all that and that's changed. How it's become like an accepted mainstream, like at the government level and at the CBC level. That's you know, pretty quick. That's pretty last handful of years. Now, what went into that was like, you know, decades and decades, of course, of Indigenous activism, and then, you know, over time, growing solidarity from non-Indigenous, initially, you know, marginal left-wing characters, and gradually, you know, more and more of the left, and then gradually, you know, sector of the sort of more mainstream liberal, and then next thing you know, even the conservative governments, like, you know, conservative politicians are sort of
talking about abolishing the Indian Act, and even Maxime Bernier of the People's Party said, yeah, that's even in his party platform, abolishing the Indian Act. So yeah.
Yeah, so that can I think that specific can play a bit both ways, but yeah, so you know, that's how it works, right? Like, you know, like all these, you know, go back in history, right? All these forces that you know, all of official politics now says we're against slavery, but, you know, that wasn't the case, of course, at one point. And even decades after slavery existed, there was still people who were, you know, right-wing forces that were calling for slavery, and that's part of a whole process of political and cultural struggles that have, you know, made that a totally outside of bounds position. And I think that with regards to Canadian colonialism, we're on a pathway towards it being like outside of bounds to say this was like, you know, this was a good thing that British and French settlers did, taking and stealing and driving off Indigenous people. But yeah, so how does that all translate into the U.S. context? You know, I don't exactly know how that happens, but I think the simple answer is that people bring it up and people raise it, and, you know, and you challenging, I don't know, some, you know, black leftists for not raising it enough is part of it, and quite frankly, you bringing it up to Aaron Mate, and, you know, I don't know, maybe Aaron thought about it after, maybe didn't, maybe did, but like if it's not brought up, he certainly won't. We know he won't think about it, but if it's brought up, at least there's a chance he might think about it. Maybe he, you know, he looked into it, and you know, that is just literally how it all works. That's how the change works. We don't always succeed in those changes. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't, depending on all kinds of different factors. But it's literally comes down to people just, you know, raising the issues, obviously doing it in the most strategic way possible, doing it in the most coordinated way possible. All those things are good things, you know, ideally that is how it happens. But just bringing it up is a, you know, small piece to the overarching puzzle of what's necessary.
And then the final question is, you know, you're an activist. I sometimes underrate you as an activist, but you are a proper activist, working to building, I call you guys the Canadian truth-telling, myth-busting movement when it comes to, the anti-imperialist movement. Yeah, what advice would you give to Indigenous people who may feel, burned out, and even their solidarity allies who might feel burned out and frustrated by some of the exchanges they may get from from people who just don't want to make Native Americans, the plight of Native Americans, their top 5 or even top 10 priority for whatever BS reason.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think people. I don't think that Indigenous people in the U.S. would necessarily their spirit of hostility to the colonial process. I'm guessing is Trump's any sort of I don't know, words of advice or words of encouragement, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously all movements, and it's really important to understand that like, people who are who face the thrust of a genocidal process, if they think there's outside support, obviously they get more emboldened to push the cause. And so that is why it is so important to have broader, at least left backing, because then that gives Indigenous activists or just Indigenous people in the U.S. more energy and whatever to push forward. But yeah, I mean, but it's also simultaneously comes the other way, and that the more that Indigenous activists push on issues, that forces the issue onto the left agenda. And again, it can be a whole sort of virtuous cycle, that the more it pushes onto the left agenda, then the more that Indigenous activists feel comfortable pushing forward, and then that's how it all works, of course. And how to get the ball going in the right direction as fast as we want, obviously that's all really complicated and kind of impossible to answer. But yeah, I think that like the more that, just as the non-Indigenous activists, by raising the issues, they open up space for Indigenous activists to push forward. Simultaneously, it works the other way. So Indigenous activists pressing the issues also forces the hand of those who may have deprioritized so-called internal U.S. colonialism to raise the issue.
So keep calm and carry on. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight.
You don't always have to be calm. I mean, I think you usually, mostly want to be calm, but sometimes it's not. You don't even need to be calm. Sometimes there's be not calm and in your face or aggressive or whatever. I think there's a place for all that. But yeah, at the macro level, mostly you want to be calm. But
Alrighty, well, Yves, we've gone over time, and it's time for me to end this interview. So we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with one of my favorite peoples, Yves Engler of the CFPI, author of all of those, all those books, 12 books, I think, and I think he's working on one on Haiti as well. And so, so we are joined on this edition with Yves Engler, the brilliant Canadian historian, NGO critic, media critic, and activist. And Yves, thank you so much for coming on such short notice. You give my best to your wonderful wife Bianca, and yeah, give my best to little Joshua and Missouri, and looking forward to Mondays, guys. Mondays, subscribe to yvesengler.com and check out Yves Engler's Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, where you get to ask questions if there's time. So, anywho, thank you, Yves.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good night. See ya.